So one of the easiest ways to make a carburetor look a little different, a lot better than they do stock, and make them a lot easier to clean is to actually powder coat them. So what I'm showing here are some carburetors that were really old and kind of disgusting, and I tore them apart, shot them with some powder coating. As you can see, they do look a lot nicer than they used to. So what we're going to do is go through all the steps it takes to tear a carburetor apart, show you some of the different options for powder coating, and then reassembly. And actually one's going to go to the dyno, and we're going to check it out and see how well it works. The subject of today's rebuild and powder coating will be this Holley 4781 850 double pumper. As you've probably seen and may have under the hood of your own hot rod, it's a well-experienced carburetor. It has seen many miles, and in the last few years it's been a carburetor at the dyno shop to test engines when people's carburetors aren't quite as well built as they should be. So I was asked by a friend to rebuild it. As long as I'm going to rebuild it, I figured I'd throw some powder coating on it and make it look a little bit nicer. Some of the things that you may want to be aware of before you take these apart is the linkage, especially on this side. You've got the choke linkage, and that can be very confusing. If you start looking into this side, you'll notice there's a lot of different plates and screws and shafts and everything else that make it work. So highly recommended that when you do this, or before you actually start, is to get your cell phone or your digital camera out, take a few pictures. That way when it's time to put it back together, you know where everything goes. Also, you may want to take a look at the bottom and take a look at the orientation of the throttle plates. You'll notice there's numbers. Some carburetors are the same, some are different, but you'll want to make sure that the primaries and the secondaries are orientated. As you can see here, the numbers are punched on the bottom and they are towards the center. By putting them back together, it helps it work just the same as it did before it came apart. And if you've never done one before, you're definitely going to want to take pictures of just about everything as you progress through to ensure you get it back together the correct way. Well, a quick battery change and I am back. So what we're going to do here is start tearing this apart. As I was reviewing everything and looking at it, I did notice that the screws in the choke blade shaft have been stripped out. So we have two choices. We can either drill them out, and of course that's going to depend on whether or not you have spare screws laying around to put back in it, or you can just leave the choke assembly in and just disconnect the shaft and the choke mechanism on the side and work with it that way. So that's something that's up to you to go either way. The nice part about these is that you can disassemble them with pretty much all the basic hand tools you have around the shop. So the bowls, they're going to come off with either a flat blade screwdriver, as we have here, or the later models have a 5/16 headed bolt. And you've also got washers behind these screws. So you can see here, these are the plastic type that are nylon, I should say, that are replacements. They last a lot longer than the old paper ones from Holley. But just the 4 screws here, and they come apart. Very simple, very easy. Now a little tap on the top of the screw and the bowl comes off. You can see there's nothing that's going to fall out. If it does, then you've got a problem. But that's basically just the primary bowl. And we turn the carburetor around real quickly. And the secondary bowl comes off. On a standard 4150 Holley, the bowls are only threaded for the fuel inlet on one side. So you'll notice this is just a smooth hole here, and then this side screws in. So when you put it together, there's only one way that you can correctly put the bowls on, so you don't have to label them front or rear unless you really want to. Again, a little tap on the nut or bolt on the top. I've seen a lot of guys, they tend to hammer on the side of the bowl, or they try to pry, and it tends to leave marks all over the bowl. So probably best if you just try and hit it on the top of the screw. If the screw ever gets messed up, it's an inexpensive piece to change. So now we can come over here. The metering blocks, sometimes because of older gaskets, you may have to get in here, oh, not that one, and pry it off, but these are some newer gaskets, so it's easy to tell that this has been rebuilt in the not too distant future, or past. And primary comes off the same. Again, the easiest way to tell the difference is the primary metering block has either a screw-in or a pressed-in vacuum source, and this will be your ported vacuum that goes to the distributor on most cars, or plugged if you're not using a vacuum advance. The secondary plate does not have that provision, it's just got a little hole there, so you don't have to worry about primary and secondary. They're pretty much only going to go in one direction. If you get it wrong, it's not that big of a deal, you just don't have access to the vacuum port. Okay, so I had to go grab my big Phillips screwdriver. There's a lot of different ways to do this. You notice I have a little stand that I made, just 1-inch steel. Welded it together, welded some nuts on, or some bolts on there, put some nuts underneath, and it's a nice little cheap stand. You know, probably cost me a couple dollars in the scrap metal laying around the shop. So now we need to get to the bottom. Take it off the stand, and I actually use an old Folgers 2-pound coffee can. Found out that that fits really nicely. Allows me to turn the carburetor over, and I can quickly take out the 6 to 8 screws depending on the year, and pull the throttle plates off. Now each of these assemblies will have some more sub-assembly work to be done, but right now we're just going to do the basics, and then we'll tear each of the sub-assemblies down before we powder coat. And normally this is just going to lift right off. The gasket will either be stuck here or here. Again, this is kind of a newer looking gasket, so this hasn't been too long between rebuilds. What we're going to do is we're going to take these screws out, and we are going to remove the throttle blades, pull the throttle shafts out, the choke mechanism, the accelerator pump, shafts, or arms and shafts, screws, and then we'll clean them up real well and we'll powder coat it. The main body, really the only thing we have to do on this one is we're going to take off the choke mechanism, and that's about the only sub-assembly we have to do, or tear down on this sub-assembly. And the bowls, what we're going to do with them is we'll pull the needle and seat, pull the float out, accelerator pump, inlet, and sight plugs, and clean them up and powder coat them. So at this point, it's a nice thing to think about, what are we going to do and how do we clean it? Powder coating loves to stick on clean material. When you're using ferrous materials such as aluminum, the oils and greases and everything and dirt that you get on them over the years actually will kind of get down into the pores of the metal. So even after you clean it, whether you're just using a wire brush and some brake parts cleaner or some carb cleaner or lacquer thinner or whatever you're using, or as I prefer, put it in the sandblast cabinet and hit it with some glass bead or some walnut shell and get it down to its really base metal. Then put it in the oven for about 30 to 45 minutes at 400 degrees. Let all the oils and contaminants burn and come out of the pores. Give it one last cleaning with a cleaner before you start the powder coating. But we will continue and you'll see how that all takes place. Okay, so one of the things I did forget to mention, which is kind of important when you're working on these, is you want to have some kind of a parts tray, because when you tear this apart you are going to end up with a lot of little parts everywhere. So it's nice to have something. Magnetic is nice for the screws and such to keep track of all your screws. So what we're going to do here is tear apart the bowls. And the first thing we're going to do is take off the fuel inlets, and these are going to be a 1-inch, so you're going to need a bigger wrench to get on there. You can use a crescent wrench or pliers, although it's always nice to have, like Dad said, the right tool for the right job. And for me, that's usually whatever tool's available at the minute, and that's what I use. And let's always try and take off sight plugs and the needle and seat with the biggest screwdriver that you can get in there to fit. As you use the smaller ones, you tend to twist off of the very soft brass, and it really makes the screws look ugly. This is also a washer on there, so don't forget that piece. It will be replaced with a new one on reassembly. Down here we have the accelerator pump. This is the primary. It's a 30 cc. You can tell in the secondary it's a much larger 50 cc. You get a bigger squirt when you really tromp down. You've got 4 screws that hold it together. When you take it off, you're going to find a diaphragm and a spring underneath. So you might want to be careful or ready for that spring to come. It's not a lot of pressure, but if you're not paying attention, it might take off on you. And of course it won't do it on this one. And we'll just drop everything in the pan. And then of course the needle and seat. Now if you take a look, you can see how that screw has been pretty well messed up by using too small of a screwdriver. Personally, I like to use a needle and seat tool. It has a piece to hold the nut, and then this piece over here loosens the screw. And what's really nice is when you're adjusting on a running motor, this will cover this area here, and the fuel won't spray all over you as the pressure tries to release when you loosen those. So you can take off the screw, nut, and needle and seat all in one piece here. And you see as it comes out, it all kinds of stays together as a unit. So at this point, the only thing left to do is get the float out. And that's just 2 screws. And this is another piece that you might want to take a picture of as you remove it. The 2 screws are easy. The problem comes in when you get it out. You'll notice that there is a spring and a shaft in there this all rides on. and that will most likely come apart on you when you leave it sitting around. But you're going to want to see how the little tang comes through the hole on the bottom of the float, and then the longer tang kind of hooks over here to allow for a spring assist on the raise. Here's the parts, and you'll notice that is really all there is to the float bowl. There's not a lot to it, very easy to take apart. And now we'll quickly do the secondary. Oops. Let's go ahead and start with the fuel inlet. Okay, well, it's usually easier to take these off when they're still attached to an engine. And that one's just going to be done later. And we'll get the rest of the pieces off for now. On this one, you'll notice that this is a much longer and deeper pump. So if you take a look at the two, you can see the 50cc and the 30cc. Not too much chance of getting those confused when you look at the entire assemblies and you're putting them back together. And also the spring is longer on the secondary. And you'll notice that these are the brass floats, same size, same type, front and rear. There are different materials these are made out of. I always prefer the brass floats, especially when using different types of fuels. They also make different types, so if you have like jet extensions for drag racing, the float is notched to clear the extended jets. So really that is all there is to tearing down float bowls. It's a very simple operation. The next step for these are over to the blast cabinet. But first let's get to the throttle plate. Now it's time to take apart the base plate. So take a look at some of the things we need to do here, like remove the linkage. Down here we have a little cotter pin. Just kind of straighten that out. Pull it out. Take the washer off the back. Into the parts bin. And the linkage is out. So the easier of the two accelerator pump arms has a piece that comes off the back, just a little E-clip, and it slides right off. Again, another easy piece. The primary, this is one of the older styles, so this could be just a little bit trickier. Instead of having an E-clip on the outside, it's got a very, very fine wire clip on the inside, which makes it really, really difficult to get at and very easy to lose if you're not careful. Which means I'll probably shoot this thing across the room. this case, we'll do the 2 screwdriver method, holding it on one side and pushing it on the other. And there's the little clip, and off everything slides. You can take off the idle adjustment screw. As you can tell, it's a long one with its spring. Keep those two together. Now let's have some real fun and take off the throttle blades. Now off camera, what I did was I took a little 1/8 inch die grinder with a ball, stone ball on it, and I cut down the edges of these screws, because from the factory what they originally do is they flatten them down, make them wider, so if they loosen up they won't come off, which makes it a little difficult to get out. But by grinding the end of it off, the screws come right out. Again, we got to make sure that when we put them back on, the numbers embossed on the bottom, the 180 on both primary and secondary, are to the inside facing down. Occasionally these things do like to break off. They are only made out of brass, so they're very soft. And I never reuse them. I've seen people who have reused them, and they've tightened them so much that the heads were brittle. And during normal operation, the head of the screw actually fell off. And of course, that tends to get down into the intake manifold, and whichever open valve is there, it's the one that takes advantage of the free screw to mess up something in the cylinder. So for a few dollars worth of screws, stainless steel, it doesn't make sense to reuse these. Just like that. There go the primaries. Well, looks like I've got one that needs to be ground down a little bit more. And just like that, all but one screw. I'll go ahead and tighten that one back down so that it's easier to get the end ground down. In the meantime, we'll go ahead and take the primary shaft off. This is one of those fun pieces off the choke that you really need to pay attention to, because it's got a spring. It's actually more than one piece in here, so make sure you take good pictures before you take it apart, and drop it in the parts drawer. At this point, the primary shaft is ready to come out. A little carbon buildup, and on this one, looks like we've got a couple little burrs where the screws came out. So let's grab the jeweler's file. Well, I guess I've got to go find one. I'll be right back. Okay, so they were where they belonged. I just didn't see them. So this is always a nice set of small files to have around the shop, just in case of things like this. And we can grab a nice flat one and just come in here burrs off the back so we keep the bores in nice shape. And just like that, the primary throttle shaft is out. Now, as long as we're going to do this real quickly, let's go ahead and turn this back over, and we'll have a quick look at. See, the metal on there is a little too much on that screw. Zoom in a little bit here, and you can see that that screw was one that just didn't quite get ground down enough. And so, just in case I'm not able to mute this or get the volume down, y'all out there in YouTube land might want to hold your ears, because it's going to get real loud for a few seconds here. I'll zoom back out so I don't completely block out what I'm doing. It's always a good idea when you're using air tools to have the correct protection. Safety glasses, ear protection, gloves, just in case. You never know when this stuff might go flying. So this is the 1/8 inch grinder with a little stone wheel on it. I believe that's probably got it. Let's flip it over and find out. And if it doesn't, I'm going to lie and say it did, and get it off camera so you don't see me floundering around with this. Okay, so I will be back shortly after I get some pliers and finish taking that little thing out. It's all eaten away, so I'll be back in a few. Okay, so I'm back. With the help of my trusty miniature locking pliers, I was able to grab the screw and twist it out. Again, these are brass, so they're very easy to strip out. The last screw's out. The last throttle blade. Come around here, take off the accelerator pump cam and its bracket. Take a little wiggle here. And there she went. Quick and easy. We got the bracket off. And this spring is hooked down here. Just unhook that, twisting the spring counterclockwise. Actually clockwise, I'm sorry. And again, secondary shaft comes out and into the parts. And the last two pieces I'd like to get out of here are the shafts that the accelerator pump arms ride on. These you really want to be careful with. They've been in there for a long time. Sometimes people put these back together with a Loctite, some kind of a thread locking and I have had them snap off. I'm going to drill them and retap, and it's easier just to be careful taking them off the first time. And this has definitely got some kind of a thread locker in there, so glad I took my time and paid attention to what I was doing. Okay, so first one's off. If you notice, I can't know if you can see that or not, but there's a little groove to the inside. This was for the primary pump arm that had the small C-clip. When I put it back together, I'm going to replace it with one that's got the groove on the outside like the secondary. That way I can just use a larger E-clip and not worry about how hard it is to get it off and lose that little guy, because they can go flying and it's just a pain to get on and off. This one looks like it's got a ton of red Loctite in there. Well, someone definitely didn't want this thing to come back apart. So, into the parts bin, and now you have basically a base plate, throttle plate, just like it came from the factory, brand new, except I didn't pull off the vacuum source in the back or the pin that holds the return spring for the secondaries. Other than that, it's ready to go into the blast cabinet with the bowls. One last thing to work on and tear down will be the main body. So, hang on a second and we will start doing that piece. Okay, so the last part of the video is going to be tearing down the main body. There's not a lot to it. Off camera I did drill out the 2 screws on the choke shaft, and I put a couple new ones in there just to keep them from getting lost. And all you need to do is pick these 2 screws out. The choke blade slides out. Disconnect the rod, slide this out. 3 screws take the choke assembly off the side of the carburetor. And then the last 2 pieces that we have to be concerned with are the squirters, or otherwise known as the accelerator pumps. And you've got just a large Phillips screwdriver. Those come off. There will be 2 gaskets, one under the screw and one under the accelerator pump itself. So, make sure those don't get stuck. And of course, they're very inexpensive, so always replace them. The last 2 pieces that are in here are check valves that go inside underneath these screws. So as we turn them over, one's on the floor, here's the other one. They're just a little check valve, pointed, and the pointy end goes down. Please don't lose those, and always make sure, especially if taking off the accelerator pumps on the car, that they don't go flying down into the carburetor. Had a buddy lose one day, took out his race motor. Cost a few thousand, so a little 5-cent piece of metal can destroy things. So that's it. That is the final teardown of the last subassembly that we're going to powder coat. The next video will show you cleaning and powder coating before we get on to the final video of reassembly. Thank you. Just a quick little update here before we go. Earlier on we spoke about putting together some kind of a parts bin for all the parts because there would be quite a few of them. And that shows you all the small pieces that are left over after taking the carburetor apart. For people doing this for the first time or not doing it very often, it's not a bad idea maybe to lay them out as you take them apart. Or if you've done this a few times, have some kind of a really good manual that can also help to identify the parts when they're going back together.